Well, good morning and welcome back to the basement studio. We're continuing in our journey through the Gospel of John. I have to tell you that the material we're looking at this week and next week are particularly exciting to me. Whenever you're diving into the text as we are here, you're going to discover things that are eye-opening and potentially life-changing. I have to tell you that the stuff we're going to see at in today's class and next week's class, I think have been particularly illuminating to me, and I hope that I can communicate and share that with you effectively as we walk through it. But of course, we're still in chapter 2 of John. We're looking at the last half of the chapter, and this is where we begin the process of Jesus taking his second ministry cycle through the country of Palestine. And we called this going public because up until this point, the things that Jesus has been doing have been relatively quiet and relatively private. But now he's going to appear on the scene in the middle of Passover in Jerusalem, and the crowds are going to be attracted to Jesus and exposed to Jesus as we move forward now. So we pick up this particular cycle, and this is just real quickly. We pick this cycle up in Jerusalem at Passover, where Jesus first clears the temple. That's the event we're looking at now. Next, we'll see him performing some miracles in Jerusalem, and then he's going to meet with a man named Nicodemus. And we're going to see that Nicodemus fits into the script in a very important way. And that's one of the things that I'm particularly excited to go over with you. Then we're going to follow Jesus out into the Judean countryside, where he doesn't directly connect with or contact John the Baptist, but nonetheless, the Apostle John gives us some comparisons between what's going on in Jesus' ministry and what's going on in the Baptist ministry at that point in time. It's going to be important for us to see those two things. And then we're going to follow Jesus as he returns to Galilee. He decides to take a route that goes through Samaria, and he meets with a woman at the well. And that, of course, is found in John chapter 4. We'll take a look at that as he's heading back north. And then he ends up in Cana, where he heals an official's son who has fallen sick in Capernaum. Okay, and that will be our second ministry cycle. But today, and really we started into this last week, we started into the section where Jesus clears the temple. This is the last half of chapter 2. Last week we spent most of our time looking at the beginning of that episode, and we looked at what Jesus did. And basically Jesus made a whip. He came in, he drove out the money changers, he drove out all of the animals out of the area, and his comment was, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" And his contention was that this was the wrong place to be doing those things. Those activities needed to be done because they were prescribed by the law. There had to be animals provided for sacrifice, and these travelers who are coming in from literally all over the world would have to be able to procure animals for sacrifice. In addition, they were prescribed in the law to offer a temple tax, and there had to be some sort of ability to change currency. And so those things were important to do, but Jesus makes the point here that this is the wrong place. What was intended to be my Father's house, you have turned into nothing more than a flea market and a street bazaar. We also looked last week at some of the opportunities for corruption that existed in this setting. There was the opportunity for money changers to charge exorbitant rates to give money that was useful in first century Palestine temple taxation. We talked about the problem with selective enforcement, where quite commonly the priests would simply say, "We don't have to pay this tax. All the common people do, but not the priests." And so they would have enforced these restrictions selectively. There was a problem with the process of which animals could be sacrificed. And they actually had individuals who are appointed and essentially licensed or registered to be able to approve which animals could be sacrificed. And of course, that sets up a great market for kickbacks and bribes, and it's just a total injustice to the people who are just simply trying to go to Jerusalem and offer their animal as a temple sacrifice to God. And what's going on now is they have to get a certificate saying that this animal has been approved. Well, the approver could very easily just simply cycle these animals around and say, well, this animal's insufficient, this animal is not approved, it's got this blemish, it's got this defect, and that defect makes it disqualifies it from being able to be an approved sacrifice. And so they'd take that disqualified animal, put it over in the pen, and then meanwhile the purchaser would have to go purchase another animal, and pretty soon that animal that was first deemed unsatisfactory or was disqualified, pretty soon they show up on the market again. And so there's this cycle going on where things are just absolutely being it's just a measure of injustice being inflicted upon the common people. And then finally, we talked really at some length about the problems with the temple authorities. And we talked specifically about the high priest Annas, whose reputation throughout history has been one of just simply being a greedy high priest. And his whole family was greedy. They were so greedy that in the 60s AD, the popular membership of the Jews living in Palestine actually rose up against them and overthrew them. And so there was this continuing struggle that had developed. And if there's anything I want you to get out of last week, that's what I want you to see. I want you to see that there was this division occurring between, on one hand, the temple authorities and what they were able to get away with and what they were able to inflict upon the people, the injustices and the punishments, and then on the other hand, the common people who are under the yoke of those people, but nonetheless, they're not happy about it at all. And as I said, eventually it erupted into a minor rebellion in the 60s AD. So there's this division already occurring amongst the people that Jesus walks into the middle of. Okay? All right. So we talked about Jesus's actions in the temple and what he did. Now we take a look at the reaction of the Jews. And when we use the phrase the Jews, we're using the phrase that John the Apostle uses when he describes them. And he's not referring to all Jews. He's referring to those Jews who are in charge of things. The Jews who are the temple authorities. When John uses that phrase, that's the people we ought to think of in our minds, because all these people are Jews. One form or fashion. Jesus himself, of course, was a Jew. So John the Apostle is a Jew. All of the disciples are Jews. They're all Jews. But when John the Apostle uses the phrase the Jews, we need to be thinking of those temple authorities and those people who are part of the religious establishment and that were causing so much of a problem for people. And so as we take a look at this, we're going to see the first real clear conflict in Jesus' ministry. All right, so we're going to read now. This is chapter 2, verses 18 through 22. So let's take just a second and read that together. This, of course, is immediately after Jesus has driven out the money changers and the animals. Then the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." And the Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said, and then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So now Jesus and the religious establishment are coming into direct conflict. Who was Jesus really criticizing? Well, on the surface, it looks like it was obviously the merchants and the money changers that were working in the temple. But underneath that was the real problem. Underneath the money changers and the merchants was the Jewish leadership. They were the ones who were allowing this to go on, who were encouraging it to go on, and ultimately they were the ones who were profiting from all of these activities. And verse 18 brings this problem into clear focus. Let's look at it again. The Jews demanded, they didn't ask, they demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" And what the Jewish authorities were saying was, who is in control here? Who has the authority? So they don't directly threaten Jesus, but they challenge him on technical grounds. And particularly and specifically, the technical grounds they raise is, what's your authority for doing this? Now, I don't know if you've ever been a part of business meetings or other types of meetings. I suppose they could be political or community meetings of one sort or another. And somebody in the meeting doesn't like the direction the meeting is obviously heading. And they see that they don't have the votes to deal with the issue on its substance alone. They see that they're going to be outnumbered if they just take a vote. What do? Well, they start arguing on technical grounds. They start going back and saying, well, we don't have enough people here to be a quorum and to be adequately representing the wishes of whatever group this might be. Or we haven't had enough time to think about this. Our bylaws call for 6 weeks of notice or something like that, and we've only had 5 weeks and 6 days of notice. And these are technical arguments. They see they don't really have the ability to overturn the issue on its substance, but they want to get in its way, that's for sure. And that's what's going on here. These Jews know that they can't impede Jesus's momentum on the issue itself because he's right. He's absolutely right. They have turned this sacred place into a flea market. And that's what's going on in a place that should be the house of God. And so, why did they do that? Well, think about this for a minute. By this time, Jesus undoubtedly does have many supporters. We don't read about it in the Gospel of John, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see his ministry up in Galilee, and it has already begun to flourish. There are a lot of people that are following Jesus. And so he has a lot of popular appeal and a lot of support for his different actions. And so I think the question that the authorities are driving at here really is reflecting on Jesus being so popular. And because he's so popular, they know they have to be a little bit cautious in how they approach him, or they'll get in trouble with the people. And we're going to see that in other places in the Gospel of John, but it shows up already here in this very first conflict of Jesus' ministry. Okay, now what do they challenge Jesus with? Well, they tell him, if you have this authority, then you need to establish it and show it by a miraculous sign. Well, in their minds, they're setting him up to fail because they don't really believe, they haven't seen that he can do special supernatural things. And so by challenging him to perform a miracle in order to do this, they're setting him up for failure. Okay? At least in their minds. Who has miraculous power anyhow? This guy, we'll set the bar so high that he can't jump over it. Well, of course, they didn't know who they were setting the bar for. But how does Jesus respond? Jesus doesn't give them a sign. Not a visible sign that they experience at that time. But what he does instead of giving them a sign that they can look at right then and understand, he tells them that in the future, there will be a sign that will be the greatest sign of history. So he doesn't perform a sign right at the moment, but he foresees and foretells what's going to happen that will be the sign that will prove his legitimacy. And that's recorded in verse 19. where he says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And of course, what's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the fact that either 2 or 3 years from that very time, given that this was Passover, he would be killed. The destruction of his temple would be his death. And then he would be resurrected 3 days later. Okay? And so Jesus does not give them the sign they're looking for to establish his authority, but he tells them about a sign that is going to come. And this is an amazing response. In this very first moment of conflict, Jesus sees not only the battle lines that are already established, that are already drawn up, that are already in place. He sees those battle lines in that deep division, but he also sees the outcome. And the outcome is going to be those authorities putting him to death, and then him sustaining a victory over that when he is raised from the grave. So verse 19 here, where Jesus answers him and says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days, shows his incredible insight into what's coming. Okay? Many people, in looking at verse 19, have turned this into an if-then type statement. Okay? So in their minds, this says, if you destroy this temple, authorities, Jews, if you destroy this temple, then I will raise it again in 3 days. Okay? But the reality is this is not really, in the original language, this is not an if-then statement. It's an imperative statement. It is going to happen. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. It is going to happen. And if you look at the original language, this is a statement of truth or fact, and it's better translated something like this. And listen to the attitude here, because that's what's important. Listen to what Jesus says. Go ahead, destroy this temple as you're already planning to do, and apparently love to do, and I will raise it up again in 3 days. So you see, this thing is already in motion. It's not an if it happens, then we will react in that way. Jesus sees from this earliest statement that this thing is moving forward like a runaway train, and it will not get control. And so at this very earliest moment of conflict, he identifies the hearts of those who oppose him, the motives of those who oppose him, and the conflict that is already present, as well as its eventual outcome, and that it will erupt into his crucifixion and his death. Okay, now put yourself in the position of these Jews. You've challenged Jesus, asking him for a sign of his authority, a miraculous sign of authority, and he has given you this answer that really doesn't make much sense to you at the time. And the Jews must have been completely baffled at what Jesus said to them. They must have been completely mystified. This thing doesn't mean anything to us. And of course, they would have assumed that he's talking about the physical temple that's a stone's throw away from them. Okay? And I just want to take a look back at this temple and what it represented to the Jews, and what the process of repair and improvement that it was undergoing at that specific time, and why the Jews react then in the way that they do. But their mystique and their misunderstanding of what was going on in Jesus' mind is understandable. It's completely understandable. Solomon's original temple was built about 950 BC. And of course, that was the beauty of the temple was incomparable. Those who saw the second temple built wept when they saw that, when they saw the second temple, because I think they remembered Solomon's temple and all of its grandeur, which the second temple did not possess. But you'll recall that Solomon brought in logs from Lebanon, from the cedars, and used those to furnish the temple. He used all the highest quality materials. There was nothing spared in the original construction of the temple. But nonetheless, in 586, when Babylon came in and destroyed Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar, that temple was destroyed. And we have really no record of that further in history. Then, after the time of Babylonian exile in the early 500s BC, under the leadership of the Jewish governor Zerubbabel, the temple began to be rebuilt. And it took several generations for that temple process to be completed. And you can read about that in not only Ezra and Nehemiah, but also in some of the prophets. The prophets Zechariah and Haggai particularly speak of the need to complete the process of rebuilding the temple. But that temple was the one that seemed substandard compared to Solomon's original temple. And King Herod, in 20 BC, Herod began this process of major renovations for the temple. And not just the temple itself, but also the temple grounds, and in fact the whole mountain upon which it was built. And Herod began this process of renovations and restorations, which was really incredible. Ultimately, the temple was finished in gold and marble. Its exterior glistened in the sun. Its height was between 150 and 200 feet. It was between the height of a 15 and 20-story building. Now, we don't know exactly the floor plan. We don't know exactly its size. We don't know exactly how the different courts were configured. But it was not just a simple construction of, on the top of this hill, there were some walls built and then a hut in the middle with an altar. It was nothing like that. This was an incredible feat of both engineering and architecture to get the temple in the condition that it was built in Herod's day. It was by the way, I took a look. The Roman Colosseum, which of course part of it still stands, its height is 157 feet. It's estimated that Herod's temple was between 150 feet and 200 feet high. It may well have been almost a third higher than the Roman Colosseum. And that gives you an idea of how grand this temple was and what an incredible structure it really was. Between the not so much the temple itself, but the grounds, all of the courts of the Gentiles, the courts of the women, the courts of the Israelite men, and then the courts of the priests. This was intended to be the size that it could accommodate a few 100,000 worshipers. That was the size that the scope of this construction project that was going on. It had the Temple Mount had the surface area of about 11 football fields placed next to each other like a jigsaw puzzle. That's how big the mountain was. When Herod underwent this building and reconstruction project, he had to basically cut away a section of the mountain and then underlay it with giant stones and reinforcements to support the buildings of the walls, the temple court facilities, the colonnades, the places where there were columns and roofs to accommodate bad weather and things like that, and then of course the space for the temple itself. The temple itself did not take up a big footprint on this 11 football field space. It was actually relatively small in its area, surface area, but it stood tall so everybody could see it. And as you came up Mount Moriah towards Jerusalem, or if you looked from the west, from Mount Zion back to Mount Moriah where the temple stood, you would see that temple sticking out and shining in its gold and its splendor. It had to be an incredible sight, and there are multiple references to this site that show up in first century literature. And people essentially saying, if you haven't seen it, people that travel the entire world would say, if you haven't seen this, you haven't lived. And so this was the scope of this building project. There were some retention stones that were placed into the foundations and things like that were as large, according to Josephus, they were as large, these stones that were built and moved there for support were as large as 37 feet long by 18 feet wide by 12 feet high. Now that's a big rock to move. And how to do that and build it into its position, as well as to then make all of the structures that are built on top of this, all of that to work together. This is an enormous architectural and engineering feat. And it was a wonder of the ancient world. Now, this was what the Jews saw as Jesus speaks to them. And Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Well, this work had been going on for 46 years already. So it started in 20 BC. That tells us that this was now 26 AD, okay, when Jesus is just coming into his ministry. And so this is still going to go on for another, 38 years. The temple and all the grounds were not finally finished until 64 AD. And of course, when Rome came in under the general Titus, they completely destroyed this temple, just as Nebuchadnezzar had done in Babylon. Rome completely destroyed this temple in 70 AD. So at this point in time, in 26 AD, as Jesus is entering into his ministry, and he goes to the temple and throws out the money changers, and then he gives them this prophetic message: if you destroy this temple, I will raise it again in 3 days. He is seeing ahead to what he's going to do, not with the physical temple, but with his body. And so it's no wonder that these Jews had no understanding of what Jesus was talking about. They, of course, think this is referring to the physical temple that's in the process of this remarkable restoration and building project. And, it's not possible to fix this thing and do it in 3 days. We've been working on it for 46 years, and it's not going to be completed for another, what was the number I said? I think I said 38. It's going to be 28, because 28 and 26 is 64, I think. 28 and 26. No, it's 54. It is going to be 38 years. So it'll be 30. It's still ongoing for another 38 years. And so the Jews had to be puzzled by Jesus' response. What in the world is he saying? And the interesting thing is, once again, John the Apostle lets us behind the curtain. And he sort of tells us the disciples didn't understand it either until later. And at later, when Jesus was raised, then they understood it. Look carefully at verse 22. And John says, after he was raised from the disciples, then his disciples recalled what he had said. They believed the scripture and the words Jesus had spoken. So even though Jesus answers their question, it's kind of an obtuse answer. It's one that they can't begin to understand. And it's one that they will only understand in hindsight. And of course, hindsight is 20/20, right? You can always see things at the end of the day. So Jesus is the only one who really understood what he was saying and how he was answering this. And what he's saying here is the die is cast. The path is fixed. This is the direction this thing is going to play out. And this opposition that has started to erupt now is ultimately going to bring about my death, and then I will overcome it by my resurrection. So he anticipates, and this is one of those fascinating things, he anticipates the sacrifice that will make all of these temple trappings obsolete. All of these things that they're doing, the sacrifices, the taxes, the Jewish society, all of those things are going to come crumbling down when his prophecy is fulfilled. and because he has a new kingdom which he is bringing and a new type of relationship with God that will be established. So it's a remarkable time, it's a remarkable occasion, it's a remarkable insight that Jesus shares with us here. Okay. I'm going to go on just a little bit, but not too far. Following these comments, and we see the reaction of the Jews, and then, of course, Jesus offering this prophecy. Following this, we see more actions and reactions. And this we're going to read about in chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Okay. So far, we've seen two opposite reactions to Jesus thus far. All right. One reaction is that of the Jews, who from the very beginning, those Jews are, of course, the temple authorities, don't forget that. Those Jews are opposed to Jesus and what he represents. In chapter 1, we saw them challenging John the Baptist out in the wilderness. Remember that? Yeah. And then now they're challenging Jesus after he has attacked their practices and their priorities. And Jesus has foretold the fact that their ultimate intent is to kill him. Okay, so the reaction of the Jews is over here. But there's a reaction of some others that we've learned about who have become Jesus' disciples. And we've been introduced to some of them. And these are the followers who are learning to put their trust in Jesus. At least 5 were converted or convinced during his time in the wilderness. Peter, Andrew, John, Philip, and Nathanael. We read about all of those in chapter 1. And each one of them comes to believe that Jesus is the Messiah that they've been awaiting for centuries. Then their conviction grows after they witness the miracle at Cana, and they recognize that Jesus has special powers and he will be able to take care of them no matter what. And then in chapter 2, verse 23, after they see Jesus clear the temple, and he's confronted by the authorities, and he gives them this prophecy, destroy this temple and I'll restore it in 3 days. Then, according to verse 23, verse 22, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said, and they believed the scripture. So John, looking back, says, we didn't understand it at the time, but ultimately we saw what Jesus was talking about when he uttered those words. Okay, and so these disciples have been growing in their faith as we move along. But now we're going to see a third position. Okay, we've got those who oppose Jesus. We've got those who are clearly identifying with Jesus and taking his leadership. Now we're going to see a third position develop. And I want us to read chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. Okay? And so this is indeed Jesus' coming out party. We saw as he journeys into Jerusalem, the first thing he does publicly is he cleans out the temple, and he's confronted by the temple leadership. But then after that, he goes around the town continuing to do various miraculous signs. We don't know exactly what those were, but just imagine the crowds and the chaos that must have been present in Jerusalem at Passover. Imagine the drama when Jesus took on the corrupt religious leaders in their arena and he claims control over his Father's house in the temple. Imagine the tension as Jesus handles the challenges and the accusations that are being made against him. Imagine the overwhelming support of the common people, the masses, as he fights their cause and against the greed and the abuse of those in power. And now imagine the awe as he performs miracles in public to be seen and witnessed by everyone. And most likely we can imagine that these miracles were primarily healings of various types. There would be many people, invalids and people with long-term infirmities that would have been around the temple and in Jerusalem, because that was the place where they could expect to receive some donations and receive some alms so that they could continue to survive. So what is the reaction of these people to Jesus? Okay, it's not that of the Jews, but it's not really that of the disciples either. And what the Bible says in chapter 2, verse 23, it says, they believe in his name. How could they not? With what they're seeing, how could you not believe that Jesus had some special powers and special gifts? No, when you are confronted by that, you have to be convinced of the reality of it. I mean, when you see something like that with your eyes, you can't help but have a level of belief. But what did Jesus think about their belief? Well, according to verse 24, it says Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. It tells us that Jesus couldn't commit himself back to them. And in verse 25, it says he did not need man's testimony about man because he knew what was in a man. And what he's saying there is that Jesus discerned that these people, although they believed, they didn't really trust him yet. They weren't fully in his camp. And so this defines sort of a middle position of faith. Not opposition and not fully trusting and ready to go to ultimately to the death for it, but this third position where you're still, you think you've seen what you've seen, but you're not really convinced, and you don't know where this is going to lead. And so there's this middle ground of faith. They don't really oppose him like his enemies. They don't really trust him either like his disciples, but there's this place in between where they're amazed by him. They're amazed by his rhetoric, his speech. They're amazed by his logic. They're amazed by the strength of his character and how he can hold up under these incredibly pressure-packed situations. They're amazed at his miracles, but they're not convinced enough for Jesus to be able to rely on them. They have been attracted, but they have not yet been converted. And this is a position that we're going to refer to as miracle faith. It's that immature level of faith that's a curiosity, but not a conviction. And that's where I'm going to drop it today. We will come back to this next week, and I'm going to have quite a few more comments about this middle ground, about what it means to be to own miracle faith and what that's all about. So I hope this is helpful to you. I hope you're getting excited about it. For next week, I would encourage you to again read the tail end of chapter 2 here, but also read into chapter 3, because we're going to see that Jesus' connection with Nicodemus is based on this third position. And Nicodemus is one of those that falls into that third position, not really sure where things are with Jesus. Okay, don't forget, God is good all the time, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you.